In the late 18th century, in the rolling landscapes of what is now South Africa, a child was born who would one day be known far beyond her homeland. Her name was Sarah Baartman, and she came into the world around the year 1789 as part of the Khoikhoi people, an indigenous community with deep cultural traditions, rich storytelling, and strong connections to the land. For her, life at first was shaped by family bonds, community rituals, and the rhythms of daily survival. But the larger forces of history, colonial expansion, social upheaval, and the unequal balance of power between Europe and Africa, were already moving in ways that would soon alter her destiny forever. To understand Sarah's journey, it's important to begin here, with her origins. She was not simply a name in history books or a figure caught in tragedy. She was a daughter, a young woman who laughed, sang, and lived as others in her village did. The Khoikhoi were pastoralists, moving with their herds, trading with neighbors, and preserving knowledge passed down through generations. It was in this environment that Sarah grew up, unaware that her life would later become a symbol of exploitation and resilience. The year of her birth placed her at a crossroads. By the late 1700s, European powers were tightening their control over the Cape, bringing conflict, land loss, and cultural erosion to indigenous communities. For families like Sarah's, this meant survival became increasingly difficult. The loss of land and autonomy forced many Khoikhoi into roles as servants or laborers in colonial households. It was within this turbulent environment that Sarah's path began to change. Her story is not only about personal struggle but also about how larger systems of power can shape the fate of an individual. By following Sarah's life, we also uncover the story of an entire people confronted with displacement, misunderstanding, and the weight of prejudice. Her journey, from her quiet beginnings in South Africa to the challenges she would later face in foreign lands, continues to echo through history, reminding us of the importance of dignity and human worth. As we begin this exploration of Sarah Baartman's life, I invite you to stay with us until the end, where we reflect not only on her struggles but also on her legacy. If you find value in uncovering stories like this, stories that history often tried to silence, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. Together, we can keep these voices alive. The years that followed Sarah Baartman's childhood were marked by change that no one in her village could have anticipated. The rhythms of daily life, the tending of cattle, the laughter around the fire, the songs carried on the wind, were slowly drowned out by the arrival of foreign powers pressing deeper into her homeland. The land that once gave freely to her people was taken piece by piece, and the communities that had thrived for generations found themselves caught in the storms of conflict and dispossession. For Sarah, this upheaval was not abstract. It reached directly into her life, scattering the bonds of family and community that had once given her strength. Loved ones were lost, neighbors disappeared, and the structures that had once kept her world safe seemed to unravel. She was still so young, yet already she carried the weight of loss on her shoulders. Where there had once been certainty, there was now only survival. Cape Town, a bustling colonial port, became the place where her path would next unfold. Drawn by necessity rather than choice, she found herself working in service to others, far removed from the life she had once known. The city was alive with ships docking from distant lands, merchants trading goods from across the world, and voices speaking in tongues that felt foreign to her ears. Amidst this energy, Sarah lived a quieter, harsher reality. Her work as a servant placed her in households where she was expected to blend into the background, unseen yet constantly present. Each day demanded long hours, obedience, and the ability to adapt to a world that had little regard for her own traditions or identity. She was part of the machinery that kept colonial life running smoothly, but rarely was she acknowledged as an individual with dreams, feelings, and memories of home. And yet, even within this environment, Sarah carried within her the strength of her heritage. She had learned resilience from the hardships she had endured. The loss she had faced had carved deep scars, but it had also instilled in her a quiet determination. Cape Town, with all its noise and commerce, could not erase who she was at her core. At the same time, the city exposed her to encounters that would alter her future in unexpected ways. Among those who moved through Cape Town were soldiers, settlers, and opportunists looking to profit from every circumstance. To them, Sarah was not simply another servant, she was someone who stood out, someone whose presence could be turned into a spectacle. These moments, seemingly small at first, would become the stepping stones toward a fate far beyond the shores of South Africa. It is here, in the midst of service and survival, that the next chapter of her story begins to take shape. Cape Town was not the end of her journey, it was the threshold. Behind the walls of the homes where she worked and in the crowded streets she passed through each day, unseen forces were gathering. Choices made by others, and circumstances beyond her control, were preparing to push her into a world she could not have imagined. Her life, once shaped by her family and the landscapes of her childhood, was about to be pulled into a different narrative, one written by strangers with power. For Sarah, the years in Cape Town were not just a period of labor and loss, they were the prelude to a story that would reach across continents and centuries. In the year 1810, a turning point arrived in Sarah Baartman's life, one that seemed, at first, to hold the promise of opportunity. After years of hardship and service in Cape Town, a new offer appeared before her. She was told stories of distant lands, of Europe with its grand cities, where fortunes could be made and where her life might finally rise above struggle. There were assurances that she would find prosperity, that her unique appearance and presence would bring her admiration rather than obscurity. To a young woman who had endured loss and displacement, the prospect of something better, however uncertain, was difficult to ignore. The voyage itself was daunting. Sarah left the familiar shores of South Africa behind, stepping onto a ship bound for lands she had only heard about in passing. The sea stretched endlessly in all directions, and each day she was carried further away from the landscapes of her youth. She could not know what awaited her, only that she was moving into a world utterly unlike her own. For weeks, she traveled across rough waters, surrounded by strangers whose language and customs felt foreign. The promise of wealth and stability echoed in her mind, perhaps bringing comfort in the face of so much uncertainty. When she arrived in Europe, however, the reality that greeted her was far from the picture she had been given. The bustling streets of London and later Paris were filled with curiosity, with eyes that lingered too long, and with voices that spoke not of opportunity but of spectacle. The same qualities that made her stand out in her homeland were seized upon by others as a way to draw attention, to entertain, to profit. Instead of being welcomed into a life of comfort, Sarah found herself placed on stages and platforms, her presence turned into a form of exhibition. Crowds would gather, not to hear her voice or know her story, but to gaze at her as though she were something apart from humanity. Her identity was stripped down to what others could point at, laugh at, or marvel over. To those who orchestrated these shows, she was not Sarah, a woman with memories of home and dreams of her own, she became an object through which money could be made. The promises that had brought her across the ocean unraveled quickly. Wealth was not hers to claim, it flowed instead to those who controlled her appearances. Admiration was not what she received, instead, she endured the weight of judgment and the cruelty of stares. Her life, once filled with the warmth of community in South Africa, had been transformed into a lonely performance under foreign lights. Yet, even in these circumstances, Sarah remained more than the role forced upon her. Behind the curtain, beyond the gaze of audiences, she carried her own quiet strength. The resilience born from her earliest losses had not vanished. Each day she stood before those crowds, she did so as someone who had endured more than they could imagine. The world might have tried to define her as a spectacle, but her existence was far greater than what they chose to see. Her journey to Europe was supposed to be the beginning of a better life. Instead, it marked the start of years of hardship and exploitation in a place where she was far from home, far from the land and people who had once given her a sense of belonging. The promises that lured her across the sea were hollow, but her story, shaped by those broken promises, would echo through history long after the stages went dark. In Europe, Sarah Baartman was stripped of her true identity and given a name that was never her own. The crowds that gathered to see her did not speak of Sarah, nor did they call her by the name her family had once used with love and familiarity. Instead, she was branded with a title created to draw attention and curiosity, a label that distorted her humanity into a caricature. They called her the Hottentot Venus, a phrase that said more about those who used it than it ever did about her. The first part of the name came from a word Europeans had long used to mock and diminish the Khoikhoi people, erasing culture and individuality with a single sound. The second part, Venus, referenced the goddess of beauty from their own mythology, but it was not meant as a compliment. It was layered with irony, as though to say that Sarah was both a curiosity and a contradiction, something to be gawked at rather than respected. With that title, her life story was rewritten for audiences who knew nothing of her past, her family, or her dreams. She became a spectacle before she even set foot on stage. This label followed her wherever she went. Pamphlets, posters, and whispered conversations all repeated the same words, spreading her fame and erasing her name at the same time. To the people who paid to see her, Hottentot Venus was not a woman at all, it was an attraction, like a carnival tent or a circus act. And yet, beneath the glittering lights of the showrooms, there was a living, breathing person who had once run across the open fields of South Africa, who had known laughter, loss, and love. The fascination that Europeans projected onto her came from her body, particularly from the features that had been celebrated within her own culture but were treated as exotic oddities abroad. Her natural figure, shaped by genetics and heritage, became the subject of endless obsession. Fashionable women layered their gowns to mimic curves they could never achieve, while the same society that envied the look turned Sarah into an object of ridicule and fantasy. She was caught in a cruel paradox, admired from afar, demeaned up close. Each time Sarah was pushed onto a stage, the label clung to her. It was spoken aloud, written down, passed around, until it became nearly impossible for her true identity to break through. What made it even more tragic was the power of repetition, how a single name could carry with it centuries of prejudice, how it could shape the way entire audiences saw her without ever pausing to ask who she really was. Still, if we peel away the distortions of that name, what remains is not the caricature they created, but the story of a woman forced to endure the weight of projection. Sarah's body was never the problem. The problem was the gaze of those who refused to see beyond it. The so-called Venus they thought they were observing was an illusion of their own making, a reflection of their desires, fears, and misconceptions. What Sarah carried with her was something they could never reduce to a label. She had resilience born of struggle, dignity in the face of mockery, and a spirit that no stage could contain. The title they gave her may have echoed through history, but her humanity, the part they tried to erase, still shines through the cracks of that false image. When we remember her now, we do not have to use the words that once chained her to ridicule. We can choose instead to speak her name, Sarah Baartman, and in doing so, we return to her some of the respect she was denied in life. She was never a spectacle, never just a label. She was a woman, a daughter of South Africa, whose story is far greater than the distorted image forced upon her. When Sarah Baartman arrived in Europe, she may have hoped for opportunity, but what she encountered was a life built around confinement. Instead of the stability and dignity she had been promised, she was placed in settings designed to strip her of both. In London and later in Paris, she was displayed not as a woman with a voice and a history but as a spectacle, something to be looked at, marveled over, and talked about without ever being truly understood. The spaces she was placed in revealed everything about how society viewed her. At times, Sarah was put into cages, her movements restricted by the very structures meant to highlight her difference. To the audience, these cages created a clear message: she was not like them. The bars served as a barrier, separating her from those who came to watch, reducing her presence to something between human and exhibit. For many spectators, the cage blurred the line between curiosity and cruelty, turning Sarah into an attraction rather than allowing her to exist as herself. The exhibitions were no better. She was paraded under bright lights, in crowded rooms filled with laughter, whispers, and gasps. Each time, her body was emphasized as though it were her only defining feature. She was asked to stand, to move, even to dance, not out of her own choice, but because others demanded it. The people who organized these shows framed her as entertainment, while the audiences looked on with a mixture of fascination and detachment. No one asked about her homeland, her family, or her story. All that mattered in those rooms was what they could see, not who she was. The cruel irony is that the very features that made Sarah a target for exploitation were also being admired and imitated by the same society that put her on display. Fashionable European women stuffed their gowns with padding to mimic curves like hers, while at the same time, Sarah herself was confined and mocked for possessing them naturally. This contradiction reveals the depth of the injustice she endured. She was admired from a distance but denied humanity up close. Living under such conditions must have been profoundly isolating. Imagine the loneliness of standing in front of a crowd, surrounded by noise and attention, yet feeling unseen. The cage and the exhibition stage took away her ability to simply exist as Sarah, they forced her into a role written by others. Day after day, she had to endure the eyes of strangers, the reach of hands that wanted to touch, and the sting of words that defined her as something less than human. And yet, within this environment, Sarah carried herself with a quiet endurance. She survived the harshness of the spectacle, the weight of ridicule, and the cruelty of being treated as an object. Her presence alone, continuing to stand, to live, to endure, was itself an act of resilience. She may not have been able to control the circumstances imposed upon her, but her story outlasted those cages and stages. Today, when we look back on the years she spent in London and Paris, what becomes clear is not the novelty of her exhibitions but the inhumanity of them. These were not shows of wonder but shows of cruelty disguised as entertainment. They remind us how easily people can be dehumanized when society chooses to see difference as spectacle rather than as humanity. Sarah's time in those cages is not just a chapter of her story, it is a mirror held up to history, asking us to confront how far people can go in denying dignity to another human being. While her captors and audiences may have seen her as a display, we know now that she was far more, a woman of strength, resilience, and depth, whose humanity could never be erased by bars or bright lights. After years of being placed on stages for the amusement of strangers, Sarah Baartman's ordeal did not end with her passing. In fact, what happened next was perhaps even more unsettling, for even in death she was not granted peace. Instead of being remembered as the daughter, the musician's wife, or the woman who once roamed the fields of South Africa, she became a subject of dissection, her body reduced to evidence in a world determined to prove its own false assumptions. In Paris, Sarah's name reached the ears of men who called themselves scientists, men of status and reputation in the intellectual circles of Europe. They claimed to seek knowledge, but their pursuit was not of truth, it was a validation for the prejudices that already shaped their world. To them, Sarah was not a woman who had lived and suffered. She was a specimen, an opportunity to examine, measure, and display traits that they believed set her apart from others. After her death in 1816, her body was taken from the morgue, not to be laid to rest, but to be opened and catalogued. Prominent figures in the scientific community gathered, their pens and brushes ready, eager to record what they believed would confirm their theories about difference. They traced the lines of her body, preserved parts in jars, and made casts that would sit in museums for decades. Each detail was treated as data, each observation framed not to honor her but to reinforce the belief that Africans were somehow less than human. The tragedy of this moment lies not only in the violation of her remains but also in the power those so-called studies carried. The writings and conclusions of respected scientists shaped public opinion. Their words were printed in books, repeated in classrooms, and spread across continents. When they declared Sarah a link between human and animal, they were not just describing her, they were dehumanizing entire communities, providing a veneer of science to justify discrimination. What makes this even more haunting is that Sarah never had the chance to speak for herself in those halls of learning. Her story was told entirely by others, through drawings, descriptions, and theories that distorted her existence. Her laughter, her songs, her memories of home, none of these mattered to the men who claimed authority over her. To them, she was not Sarah Baartman, she was an object through which they could cement their ideas of hierarchy and superiority. And yet, beneath those cold examinations, her humanity remained unshaken. She had lived, loved, and endured. She had spoken multiple languages, danced, and carried with her the culture of her people. None of that could be captured in the notes of a scientist or the plaster of a cast. What they failed to see was that Sarah was not their specimen, she was a person whose life was stolen twice, once in captivity and once in the pages of distorted science. The legacy of those dissections lingers as a stark reminder of how knowledge can be misused. Instead of opening minds, the studies on Sarah were used to close them, reinforcing boundaries that divided people rather than uniting them. But today, when we revisit her story, we have the chance to reclaim it. We can look past the measurements and the jars to recognize the truth, that Sarah Baartman was never what those scientists claimed. Her story is no longer theirs to define. It belongs to her people, to history, and to those who see in her not a specimen, but a symbol of resilience. While the scientists tried to freeze her existence in drawings and labels, we remember her as more than their conclusions, as a woman whose dignity outlives the false theories built upon her body. The glittering lights of London and Paris promised opportunity to many, but for Sarah Baartman, they revealed only shadows. Far from the warmth of her homeland, she found herself trapped in a cycle of poverty, stripped of the promises that had carried her across the ocean. The men who had assured her of comfort and fortune instead kept her in conditions barely fit for survival. She had little control over her daily life, her choices dictated by those who profited from her presence. Every day was shaped not by her will, but by the demands of others. She lived in cramped lodgings, the cold walls offering no comfort against the loneliness of being a stranger in a foreign land. While audiences paid money to gawk at her, Sarah often received little in return. The wealth she had been promised never arrived in her hands. Instead, she was left with meager scraps, just enough to keep her alive, but never enough to give her security. Hunger was a constant companion, as was exhaustion, as she was pushed from one exhibition to the next. Beyond the physical hardships, there was the weight of exploitation. Her name was used to sell tickets, her image printed on posters, her body advertised as a spectacle. Yet she herself had no say in these matters. She could not negotiate terms, nor could she step away without consequence. Each time she was placed before a crowd, it was not her decision. It was the decision of those who saw her not as a woman with rights, but as property, a possession to be managed and displayed. The absence of dignity was perhaps the heaviest burden she carried. Wherever she went, people judged her not for her spirit or her mind, but for how she looked. Instead of respect, she met with mockery and objectification. Instead of compassion, she encountered curiosity and cruelty. Even the simple act of being seen in public was transformed into an ordeal, as strangers stared, whispered, and laughed. Her humanity was overshadowed by the image others projected onto her, leaving little space for her own identity to shine through. In this world, Sarah had little agency over her own story. Decisions about her life, where she lived, how she appeared, when she performed, were all made without her voice. Her autonomy was consistently denied, leaving her trapped in circumstances that diminished her worth. The system around her was designed not to uplift, but to control, to keep her confined to a role she never chose. And yet, beneath this relentless hardship, there was still resilience. Sarah endured, day after day, even as the odds pressed heavily against her. To survive such conditions required a strength invisible to those who exploited her. Though denied dignity by others, she carried within herself a quiet dignity they could never erase. Though stripped of agency, she still existed as more than what they tried to define her as. Her poverty and exploitation were not reflections of who she truly was, but of the world that failed her. It was a world that prized profit over humanity, control over compassion. By revisiting her story, we see not only the injustice she endured, but also the enduring reminder that dignity and agency are rights every person deserves. Sarah's life in Europe was marked by exploitation, but her legacy is far greater than the suffering she endured. Today, by remembering her, we can acknowledge the injustices of the past while affirming the importance of seeing and honoring the humanity in everyone. The winter of 1815 in Paris was cold and unkind, and within that chill, Sarah Baartman's life quietly came to an end. She was only about 26 years old, an age when most people are just beginning to shape their futures, to dream of what lies ahead. For Sarah, however, the years of hardship, exploitation, and neglect had taken their toll. Her body, pushed beyond its limits, could no longer carry the weight of the suffering she had endured. Illness crept in, worsened by the poverty and mistreatment that had defined her final years, and she slipped away far from the land of her birth. Her death did not come with the peace or respect every human being deserves. There were no family members to hold her hand, no loved ones to offer comfort in her final moments. She passed away in a city that had never truly welcomed her, surrounded not by kin but by strangers who had once profited from her pain. For someone who had crossed an ocean with the promise of opportunity, it was a cruel and lonely ending. Yet Sarah's passing was not simply the conclusion of a life, it was the tragic reflection of a system that had denied her dignity from the very beginning. She had been promised prosperity and respect, but instead endured hunger, exhaustion, and ridicule. Each performance before jeering crowds chipped away at her health, leaving her weakened long before illness finally overtook her. Her death at such a young age was not only the result of disease, it was the consequence of a life lived under relentless exploitation. In the streets of Paris, her story might have seemed to fade quickly, swallowed up by the noise of a city preoccupied with other concerns. But her absence left a silence, a reminder of what had been done and what had been lost. Sarah was not merely a performer or a spectacle, as so many had been taught to see her. She was a daughter, a member of a community, a woman who deserved the chance to grow old and live freely. Her short life reveals a haunting truth, that the exploitation she faced did not just rob her of dignity during her lifetime, it robbed her of years she should have had. 26 years is far too little time for any life to end, and yet within those years Sarah had experienced displacement, grief, and constant struggle. That she endured as long as she did speaks to a strength few could comprehend, even as those around her failed to recognize it. Though Sarah passed away in obscurity, her story did not vanish with her. Over time, her life and her suffering would come to symbolize much more than the cruelty she endured. Her death marked not just the end of one woman's journey, but also the beginning of questions about how societies treat those they label as different, and how easily humanity can be overlooked when profit and prejudice dominate. Sarah Baartman's final days in Paris remind us of the importance of compassion, of listening, of honoring the dignity of every individual. She was more than the role forced upon her, she was a human being with hopes and dreams, silenced too soon by a world that refused to see her for who she truly was. While her life was brief and her end unjust, her memory endures, urging us to remember the cost of injustice and the value of every life. When Sarah Baartman's life ended in Paris in 1815, one might have expected that her story would finally find its close, that she would be granted the peace denied to her in life. Yet even in death, dignity was withheld. Instead of being laid to rest with respect, her body was taken into the hands of men who saw not a human being, but an opportunity. The same society that had profited from displaying her in life now sought to make her a permanent exhibit, a subject of study, and a symbol twisted to fit their own beliefs. Her body was dissected by scientists who claimed to pursue knowledge. They recorded measurements, preserved parts, and constructed plaster casts meant to freeze her in time. But this was not science in the service of truth, it was science in the service of prejudice. Every note taken, every drawing sketched, was shaped by assumptions that sought to reduce entire communities to stereotypes. In this way, Sarah was denied her humanity a second time, first in the exhibitions where she was treated as a spectacle, and now in the laboratories where her remains became data. What followed was perhaps even more haunting. Her body, instead of being buried, was placed on display. For over a century and a half, French museums presented her remains as objects of curiosity. Visitors could walk past glass cases where her image had been preserved, never pausing to consider the life behind those features. To many, she was still the so-called Hottentot Venus, the label forced upon her during her lifetime, rather than Sarah Baartman, the woman who had once walked freely under South African skies. Generations came and went while Sarah remained confined to those halls. Children, students, and scholars looked upon her as if she were a relic of the past, while the injustice of her treatment remained largely unchallenged. For 150 years, her story was told not through her own words, but through the distorted lens of those who had claimed authority over her body. Her humanity was buried beneath plaster, glass, and the cold gaze of scientific curiosity. And yet, even in this prolonged indignity, Sarah's presence could not be erased. The very act of displaying her kept her story alive, though in a fractured and distorted form. Each visitor who saw her became part of the chain that carried her memory forward, even if they did not realize it. Over time, voices began to rise in protest, voices that recognized that what had been done to Sarah was not preservation, but violation. Her remains became a symbol, not of the so-called differences scientists once claimed to prove, but of the exploitation and racism embedded in centuries of colonial history. The question was no longer about the measurements of her body, it was about the ethics of a world that could deny someone rest for over a century. Sarah's story forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about how far societies had gone to dehumanize others, even under the guise of learning. For 150 years, Sarah Baartman remained a captive, long after her death. But her enduring presence in those museums also ensured that she would not be forgotten. When her remains were finally returned to her homeland, it was not simply an act of repatriation, it was an acknowledgement that what had been done to her was wrong. Her long confinement in those displays stands today as one of history's starkest reminders of the importance of dignity, both in life and in death. Though she was denied peace for so long, the eventual recognition of her humanity shows that her story could not be silenced. Sarah Baartman's legacy endures, not as a specimen, but as a voice calling across time, urging us to do better, to see more clearly, and to honor the humanity in every individual. Nearly 2 centuries after Sarah Baartman first left her homeland, her journey finally came full circle. For years, South Africa had pressed for her return, insisting that the woman who had been taken, displayed, and dissected deserved to rest on her own soil. The struggle was long, marked by negotiations and resistance, but in 2002, justice at last prevailed. Her remains were repatriated, carried back across the ocean to the land of her ancestors. When Sarah's body was finally laid to rest, it was more than a burial. It was a ceremony of restoration, a collective acknowledgement of the injustice she endured and the dignity she had always deserved. Leaders, community members, and descendants of her people gathered to honor her not as a curiosity, not as a specimen, but as a daughter of Africa. Songs were sung, prayers were spoken, and the ground received her gently, as if embracing her after a long exile. That moment was deeply symbolic. Sarah had been denied agency in life, her voice silenced and her choices stripped away. But in death, she became a symbol of resilience and a reminder of the strength of those who fight for truth. Her repatriation was not just about her, it was about every person who had been diminished, silenced, or forgotten by history. By bringing her home, South Africa reclaimed more than her remains, it reclaimed her story, her humanity, and her rightful place in the memory of her people. For the world, her burial in 2002 was a turning point. It forced nations, institutions, and museums to reflect on how they had treated the legacies of those who suffered under colonialism. It asked hard questions: who has the right to tell someone's story? How long must dignity be delayed? And what can be done to ensure that no life is ever again reduced to an object of spectacle? Sarah Baartman's life was short, and her suffering immense, but her return to South Africa transformed her into a lasting emblem of justice. No longer confined to the cold halls of foreign museums, she rests beneath the same sky she once gazed upon as a child, her spirit finally free. Her story, though marked by tragedy, continues to teach, to inspire, and to remind us of the power of perseverance against injustice. As we remember her tonight, let us carry forward the lessons of her journey. May her legacy strengthen our commitment to dignity, compassion, and respect for every life. If her story moved you, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue uncovering the stories that history tried to bury. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for honoring Sarah's memory with us. Sleep well, and may you carry peace into your dreams.